Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
And I'm Joanna Baron, executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Christine is away today. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about a sad story and the legality of psilocybin, aka magic mushrooms.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to talk about France's surprise arrest of billionaire Pavel Durov, a move that has many libertarians worried about the future of free speech. If you haven't heard of Pavel Durov, you're not the only one. I actually hadn't heard of him until I was watching CNN the other night, and they kept showing these pictures of this very fit, shirtless Russian guy, and that kind of piqued my interest. It turns out Durov is the founder of Telegram, which is a really important messaging app with nearly 1 billion users. And he was arrested on Saturday night after he landed in France, which is one of several countries where he has citizenship. So Telegram, if you don't know it, is a bit like WhatsApp, a bit like WeChat, since you can interact with groups to organize people, whether it's, anti-Israel protests or democracy protests in countries like Iran or Russia. And your conversations are not going to be open to the whole world to see like they would be if you were organizing on X. And this obviously increases the chance of taking your opponents by surprise. But it's also just a regular messaging app like WhatsApp or WeChat. So like any platform, Telegram can be used for good, but it can also be used to do bad things like selling drugs or sharing child abuse images. And this is the problem France is supposedly trying to address by taking this guy down. But libertarians are concerned that this arrest means really bad things for freedom of expression, and that's what this is all really about. So basically, France is trying to hold Durov accountable for everything posted on the platform. And the fact that he refuses to moderate, he refuses to go in and proactively delete content that authorities don't like. So he was arrested officially not for censoring speech in particular, but libertarians still see this arrest as a way of France trying to go through the back door and send a message that they're really serious about their new Digital Services Act 2023. And that act, not unlike the Online Safety Act in the UK that we talked about last week, requires platforms to take down illegal content, including not only the really bad stuff like child abuse images, but also speech that the government doesn't like because it's so-called disinformation or hateful or otherwise harmful to society because, for example, it could lead to social disorder, which in some cases is just code for protests against governments. So libertarians think France is just using this arrest as a way to show it's serious about controlling and suppressing speech online. The specific charges are not that. They're complicity by enabling an illegal transaction, refusal to communicate information or documents necessary for carrying out and operating interceptions allowed by law, complicity in possession of pornographic images of minors, complicity in acquiring, transporting, possessing, and selling narcotics, complicity in organized fraud, laundering proceeds of an organized group's offenses, etc., etc. So again, he's not charged specifically with ignoring the EU's new censorship laws, but that's what people are thinking is going on here. So, for example, Vivek Ramaswamy, the former Republican presidential primary candidate, said on X, "It's Telegram today, it'll be X tomorrow." To which Elon Musk responded, "He's right." And Edward Snowden has called it an assault on basic human rights of speech and association, and said he's deeply saddened that Macron has descended to this level of taking hostages. RFK Jr. tweeted, he said, "The need to protect free speech has never been more urgent." And of course, scum of the earth Tucker Carlson had to weigh in, not to defend free speech, but to imply that Russia is actually better than the West because it was France that arrested Durov and not Putin, which is pretty disgusting considering that Putin literally poisoned, starved, and murdered his biggest opponent, Alexei Navalny, who Durov actually risked his own freedom back in 2014 to defend, refusing to block him during pro-democracy protests, which led to Durov having to sell his Russian social media company, which was called VK. I do think, though, that people have really good reason to be worried about France because back in May, they blocked access to TikTok in the Pacific colony of New Caledonia for a couple of weeks because people were organizing anti-government protests over voting reforms. And just over a month later, when there were riots in France, Macron again sort of floated this idea that he would just shut down social media to stop people from organizing, which we see all the time in more authoritarian countries like India. And just last month, the EU Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton made this shocking threat to Elon Musk, which is that he needs to respect the Digital Services Act, including its ban on harmful content and disinformation, during his interview with Donald Trump, the US presidential candidate, as if these two are like a couple of, criminals just for having a freely broadcast conversation online. And of course, we'd be remiss not to mention that bombshell from this past week where Zuckerberg said that he regrets not being more outspoken about the Biden administration's pressure in 2021 to censor COVID-19 related content on Facebook and his regrets over the decision to demote a New York Post story on the Biden family's connection to Burisma during the 2020 election, which turned out to be factually correct. So even in America, with its robust First Amendment protections, these censorship risks exist as long as corporations are willing to play ball. And that's why Durov was so important, because he just wasn't willing to play ball. So to try and be fair to Macron, he does suggest that this was the decision of an independent judiciary, which I suppose is possible. He's sort of doing damage control because people are saying that tech companies are now going to flee France. And he said on X that, quote, "The arrest of the president on Telegram on French soil took place as part of an ongoing judicial investigation. It is in no way a political decision. It's up to judges to rule on the matter." And he could be released as early as today as we record this podcast, but I suspect he won't. Obviously, we can get behind, trying to do something about child abuse images, but when we start getting into like harmful content or misinformation, that tends to just mean content that governments don't like or that poses a threat to them. And so this is really concerning. It's sending a really chilling message about free speech in Europe. And as we pointed out before, there are already laws against things like child abuse images. And if police get a tip, they should be able to go to something like Telegram with a warrant and get it handed over. But they shouldn't be able to do what they're doing now, which is try to proactively pressure all of these companies into censoring all kinds of different speech ahead of time. Like that's just not on. So I also want to point out police can infiltrate Telegram. Back in June, and I sort of missed this at the time, RCMP charged a Quebec man with willful promotion of hatred against Jewish people for comments he allegedly made on Telegram. And they also seized a bunch of 3D printed guns, which may have also been connected to Telegram. So it's not as if police tactics can't already infiltrate and prevent true crime that's going on a platform like Telegram. Other people have pointed out, like, it just doesn't make sense to arrest the CEO for every crime that goes on a platform like this. It's like arresting the Honda CEO because people drink and drive, or arresting the Canada Post CEO because people mailed some illegal images through the mail. It's just sort of too remote to make sense. And I think Canadians should also be concerned because, as we know, Canada is trying to toughen restrictions on speech online. And thankfully, Bill C-63, which is the current proposal, doesn't go so far as Europe's. It doesn't target so-called misinformation, but it does target a list of categories of harmful content, which includes content that supposedly foments hatred, which social media companies would be required to proactively block or face potential fines. And that means something like Telegram would be operating illegally in Canada. And I could see the CRTC at some future date trying to completely shut it down. So I know there's a lot of information, Joanna. I know you were really interested in this story too when you saw it a few days ago. Anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the point that you made, because I think this is the key, that this is the analogy to arresting the Honda CEO because people drink and drive. Because They are just saying you facilitated, you failed to content moderate. That's like saying to a Honda CEO, like, you failed to put in mechanisms in your car that videotaped your drivers and monitored what they were doing. It really is like that. And with regards to the US and X or Meta, we also got news yesterday that Zuckerberg published a letter to, was it the Congress or Senate, US Senate, basically disclosing that in 2021, the Biden administration had pressured him to moderate and censor so-called COVID misinformation. And so I do think that political animus is behind a lot of these things. In this case, Durov failing to play ball with regards to the EU's fairly crazy digital safety protocols. And I certainly thought it was interesting and provocative that Zuckerberg publicly not only said this, but also said that he thought it was inappropriate. And it does set up things for possible retaliation. So anyways, I think it's a very scary precedent. We're going to be watching this closely. And again, if cops want to charge or investigate people where they can prove that in the course of commission of a crime, Telegram was used, as you mentioned, they have ways to access Telegram. But basically just going to this guy and being like, there's just too much free expression going on your platform. And also you're not giving up your user information as easily as we would like. It's highly sketchy. And I didn't know that about Tucker Carlson. Completely contemptible and vile, as always. Okay, so why don't we take a quick break and then we'll come back. Okay, so we're starting with a sort of sad story, and we're going to talk a little bit about the state of regulation and legalization of psychedelics in Canada, particularly for therapeutic and medical use. So Thomas Hartle is an individual who recently passed away from cancer. And in 2020, he was one of 4 Canadians who were granted a special exemption from Health Canada to use psilocybin, which is, of course, the hallucinogenic compound found in magic mushrooms. And he was distinguished as the first known Canadian to legally take psychedelic mushrooms. So he had a special exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which meant that Hartle could grow magic mushrooms for his own use, and he reported that it significantly helped relieve his anxiety, and I'm sure, sadness, grief, stress that weighed on him since he was diagnosed with cancer, and allowed him to spend the remainder of his life enjoying his time with his wife and children. And so psilocybin has been known for some time. There's a whole interesting history around this, but basically there were a lot of medical studies into the benefits of psilocybin and other psychedelic compounds in the 60s, actually at a hospital in Saskatchewan. But then it was all shut down and went dormant for some period. But I would say probably in the last 10 years, the so-called psychedelic renaissance, which has really not focused on, as in the 60s, partying and free love, but the medical benefits of psilocybin. And there is ample evidence, which I'm not going to get into, I'm not a doctor, but it suggests that high doses, or what are called heroic doses of psilocybin, give people these transcendent experiences, which they report significantly alleviate anxiety and depression in cancer patients and other individuals with terminal diagnoses. And Hartle said it helped him live in the moment rather than just fear what was around the corner. So Thomas Hartle was adamant that he wanted to be treated only in a safe, legal setting with medical supervision. But the exemption that he received from Health Canada was time bound, and it expired after 1 year. At which point he reapplied. But he took 500 days for Health Canada to get back to him in 2023, and they said that it had been denied. So first thing to note about this, 500 days. If you have terminal cancer, that you very well could die in that period. And his comment at the time was that it felt like they're almost waiting for me to lose my battle, aka pass away, so they don't have to deal with me and my silly psilocybin. And in the letter from Health Canada, they referenced that he had previously used a medical program in British Columbia that offers supervised psilocybin therapy under a different type of exemption, which I'll get to in a moment. And it says that he could use existing regulatory pathways to get his treatment instead of a personal exemption from the criminal prohibition of psilocybin. Of course, at that point, his health was significantly degrading, and he couldn't just go to British Columbia for his treatment. So, the article reporting on this, I think out of respect and discretion, doesn't say this outright, but he does say, I might have to use, unofficial channels to access my treatment. So that's between him and God, what he ended up doing. So Hartle made his final Facebook post in February, and he mentioned just the tremendous relief and mental space that his access to psychedelics had given him. So I'll just mention quickly, because I know this is a little bit dry, but I was researching a little bit yesterday how Canadians can legally access psilocybin. So basically, there's three ways. First is through accessing a Health Canada clinical trial, of which 36 have been authorized. The second is through what is called the Special Access Program. The third is gaining a direct exemption to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which is what Thomas Hartle did. So the SAP, or Special Access Program, applies to doctors, and it allows doctors or practitioners, so it could be psychotherapists as well, to request access to drugs that have not received market authorization for emergency treatment of patients in their care, and they're assessed on a case-by-case basis and are time limited. And so a psychotherapist might say, I'm submitting a request to carry out this program of, let's say, a 3-session protocol of psilocybin. And we know Health Canada says that about 80% of these applications are granted. But you still have to find a doctor who's willing to, do this paperwork. And then they also have to, by the way, source the drug. And I found this interesting. Alberta has been a bit of an innovator in terms of regulation of psychedelics. In January of 2023, they became the first province to regulate the medicinal use of psychedelics. It's still subject to a bunch of regulations as well as various federal regulatory regimes, but it basically sets accreditation standards for all aspects of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. It regulates the establishment of facilities that can provide this psychotherapy. So they apply and they can be accredited. So I don't know how much of that is actually happening in Alberta, but I thought it was interesting that they're sort of ahead of the curve. The general view of many people in the psychedelic community, and I was interested to see that there's like a whole cottage industry of psychedelic lawyers. And this is all kind of the hunch that psilocybin and maybe other psychedelics compounds as well are going to go the path of medical marijuana and be fully, legalized for recreational use within a few years. It's taking longer than many of them expect, a lot to do with the rise in interest rates, and there's a lot of startups working in this space, and now investors are not willing to sock as much dough into this, so there's been a bit of a chill in the last year or two, but nonetheless, the view is that in the long term, this is where things are headed. And the last thing I'll say is that there's also been pressure on Health Canada to pick up the pace of moving towards, at very least, medical legalization from veterans. So the Senate's Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs last year urged all levels of government, the feds, the provinces, the territories, to do more to fund large-scale research programs on psychedelic-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a lot of medical evidence that psychedelics can be extremely helpful in breaking up sort of the traumatic patterns in the brain that many veterans suffer. And finally, Australia has been the first country in the world. Kind of interesting. You don't think of Australia as being kind of on the vanguard of this stuff. has become the first country in the world to fully legalize medicinal use of psychedelics. So good for Australia. So my general view is that the medical evidence for the use of these is very strong. The side effects, as long as it's done in a controlled and supervised environment, are virtually none. From what I know, the real risks of psychedelics are basically dumb things people do when they're tripping or having a bad trip and not being able to integrate that. So if you have a drug that people report and that medical evidence shows significantly alleviates PTSD, depression, anxiety, gives them some relief, particularly in the context of end of life with no negative side effects, we should be doing more to make sure that people who need these drugs can get them. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Our friend Matt Buffton from the ILS this week was writing in the National Post about how we should legalize all drugs. And I don't know if I'm quite there. I think there are some drugs that are like very addictive and that lead to a lot of harm. And the practical side of me says it would be a big problem if we legalized all drugs. But something like mushrooms, it's not going to cause a huge amount of harm to legalize. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get there sooner than later. It'll be interesting to see which federal political party takes that on first. There's another aspect of this too, is that people obviously there's a big demand for mushrooms, or else there wouldn't be dozens of stores able to sustain themselves in the GTA alone. I know there's one on the street on the corner, just down the street from where I live. And part of the problem here is the injustice of just very occasionally arbitrarily deciding to enforce the drug laws that currently exist. I read a story in the Toronto Star a couple weeks ago about a guy who is 22 years old. He's a musician and he needed a part-time job, so he went to work in one of these stores, and he just sort of assumed that it's legal or that it's not a problem because there's just so many of them, right? And police came and raided that, and they arrested him. They charged him with trafficking, and he got a 60-day conditional sentence, which is very light. But he also has to do community service. And the problem with that is he now has a criminal record, and he's a young guy, and like pretty much every job is gonna do a record search, and they're gonna find this, and it's unlikely he's gonna be able to get most jobs. And also, it's going to make it impossible for him to travel to the United States. Like, he could potentially be in the system for years if he tries to go to the United States. And as a musician touring in North America, you kind of need to be able to go to the United States. So there's a lot of injustice, I think, in continuing to make this illegal when it's not causing significant harm to other people, and when people as individuals choose to use mushrooms themselves. So I think it's a matter of time before it does become legalized. And I think it's especially cruel for people who are using it for therapeutic reasons to deny them of that, even though I don't believe that all drugs should be legal. So that's sort of where I'm at on that.
Yeah, just an important point there that I forgot to mention, that also psychedelics are not considered addictive. Like they're not addictive at all. I mean, it doesn't mean that people can't make weird lifestyle choices, but they're not addictive, unlike drugs like cocaine and heroin. So that seems to be important given what we know about the human condition.
For sure, for sure. And just on that point, if you're talking about something like fentanyl, like that is causing harm to other people, in my
Yeah.
view. Like becoming addicted to fentanyl, which is very easy to become addicted to, as we've seen, it causes huge amounts of harm to the rest of the community.
Yeah.
So to me, it's in a whole different category than something like mushrooms, which um, is very unlikely to lead to harm to other people. So
Yeah, so I'd say urgent case for legalization for medical purposes, but also probably eventually full legalization for recreational purposes.
it's a matter of time.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our bad legal takes. I'll go first today. So my bad legal take goes to a supposedly bisexual man from Kenya who's been granted an extension on his residency in Canada despite an adjudicator initially finding his story was not credible. His story being that he was persecuted in Kenya for being bisexual. And not only does this guy advocate for himself to be able to stay in Canada permanently on dubious humanitarian grounds, but he's now become an advocate for status for all In other words, he wants all 500,000 or so, and that's an estimate because no one knows, 500,000 or so illegal immigrants currently living in Canada to be allowed to stay forever. And that implies that anyone else can just show up in Canada and live here regardless of whether Canada wants immigrants or has room for them. And I have a couple problems with this guy's approach. And first of all, this is an opinion that almost got me canceled from my last job at CTV. I just kind of call bullshit on the idea that all these guys claiming refugee status are bisexual, especially when they have multiple children and wives. And I say this because, and people are not normally aware of this, but there's a lot of research out there that shows bisexuality in males maybe doesn't exist at all, or is so rare that it doesn't actually show up in research. And I don't want to get too deeply into the details of this, but there is some research that shows bisexuality is quite common in women, and it's basically non-existent in men. And we know this because they take people into labs and say, "Are you bisexual?" And the bisexual women often are attracted to both sexes, whereas the men who say that, they tend to either be attracted to one or the other, either women or to men. But anyway, even if this guy is bisexual and it's bona fide, if you have a wife and a kid, I don't really think you're going to be in much danger in Africa. There would be no reason for you to be broadcasting that anyway. So are you really in danger? And if you look at the stats, like it's just a shocking number of people that are claiming that they need to stay in Canada because they're persecuted for bisexuality. My other problem with this is that even though I'm pro-immigrant, I just think it's insane to suggest Canada should continue to have virtually open borders, which we kind of do at this point because you can just claim refugee status and you'll get put up in a hotel and you'll get a hearing and another hearing and an appeal on humanitarian grounds. And then if you lose, you just stay forever anyway. So my bad legal take is just that these guys shouldn't be able to claim that they can't return to Africa because they're bisexual, even when they have a wife and kids. I just think that's not really a thing, or in most cases is sort of a made up thing. So controversial opinion almost got me canceled, like I said, from CTV, and if because I doubted one of these cases once in the newsroom, but thankfully I was gay, and otherwise I would have been fired. Joanna, don't fire me. Let's just hear your BLT instead.
Spicy take on bisexuality. I have no comment on that. My bad legal take of the week is a twofer. The first part goes to Disney, which claimed that an individual, because they signed up for Disney Plus, forfeited his right to sue the company. So what happened was there was a man whose wife died from an allergic reaction at a restaurant at Disney World last year. And then it turned out that he had signed up for a trial of Disney Plus streaming back in 2019. And buried deep down the infinite scroll in the Disney Plus terms and conditions is a clause that you will agree to take any grievances with the Disney company to arbitration instead of court. And Disney sought to enforce that clause and force this widower to go to arbitration for this wrongful death lawsuit instead of in court. Now it seems like they are walking that back. So I guess that's good, but kind of like psychotic that they brought this up. Seems totally unconscionable in the first place. So bad legal take, but good that you're walking that back, Disney. But the bigger bad legal take is kind of on all of us. There was a study a few years ago that found that out of 543 university students who signed up for a fake social media platform, all of them agreed to the terms of conditions, which included a clause in the contract which required that by signing up for the social media platform, they also gave up the rights to their firstborn child. So you may have signed away your children, your kidneys, God knows whatever else. So I am fully aware that this is not going to make any of us read through the terms and conditions. Although I also discovered that there are AIs that you can use now, like they call them TLDR terms and conditions, that can just like flag and highlight the upshot of these long jargon-filled terms and conditions. So you may want to consider that. But otherwise, yes, the bad legal take is on all of us for just scrolling through, signing up for our free trials on social media, and not knowing what jeopardy we're putting ourselves in.
All right, finally some use for AI.
Yeah.
As usual, we hope you'll rate us, review us, and subscribe. And you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our Freedom Update newsletter. And the CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thank you.